Reverend Dr. Linda Eastwood has a long and varied career as a physicist, a Presbyterian minister, a seminary professor, and coordinator of the Colombia Accompaniment Program for Presbyterian Peace Fellowship. She was recently honored by PPF as recipient of the Ann Barstow and Tom Driver Award for Nonviolent Direct Action. We welcome Dr. Eastwood to Different Drummers. You've worn so many hats, growing up in England, from a scientist to a minister, to a peacemaker, to seminary professor. How has God guided you through this journey? And have you had any surprises along the way?
Of course. So yeah, I grew up in England and then ended up in Scotland doing a PhD in medical physics. And I happened to be in the right place at the right time to be pretty much in at the birth of MRI, magnetic resonance imaging, in the early 80s. And had a 25-year career in that, mostly in industry, before I changed direction. Surprises along the way, many. One of them, of course, was ending up in the US. So I was recruited over here, thought I'd come over for maybe 2 or 3 years. And that was 1986, and I'm now a dual citizen, so I guess I'm staying. Another one was actually going to seminary. I decided long before I quit my first career that I would quit it at some point and do something different, but I knew it wasn't going to be seminary. And God has a great sense of humor, and lots of other people figured it out before I did. And then perhaps the final one I mentioned, because I think it's important, is one of the seminaries I visited, which shall remain nameless. Several people there, when they heard about my sort of change of direction, made comments like, "Oh, you finally saw the light," as if the only way to sort of serve God's ministry is to go into ordained ministry. And I just totally disagree with that. So I think we all serve God and serve each other in very different ways. And I see my career in MRI as just as much part of that journey as the stage I'm in now. So yeah, surprises, but mostly good ones.
That sounds amazing. I love how God brings everything together in a divine plan. We've learned that you've learned Spanish and you've become a part of the Presbyterian Peace Fellowship's Accompaniment Program. Can you tell us about that program and something that really just took a hold of you from that experience?
Well, I think I'll tell you first a little bit about the Presbyterian Peace Fellowship itself, just to set the context. So it started as an independent group of members of the Presbyterian Church USA right back in World War II, as a community of conscientious objectors. And its members have expanded its peacemaking work ever since, in the Middle East, particularly Palestine, in Latin America, including in Central America in the 80s, and in issues of gun violence and climate justice and more. Colombia has, this is Colombia that's at the north of South America, has experienced civil war since about the 1950s. And many communities have been hurt by that violence. About 8 million people have been displaced by the conflict between left-wing guerrillas and right-wing paramilitaries. And in theory, not in practice, the paramilitaries have been disbanded, and the government signed a peace deal back in 2016 with the FARC, the main guerrilla group. But conflict continues, and human rights and land rights leaders are particularly targeted. So even since the peace agreement was signed, over 400 social leaders have been killed and hundreds more harassed or forcibly displaced since then. So that's the context in which the Presbyterian Church in Colombia became involved in working alongside those who'd been displaced by violence. And in the process, they became targets themselves. So back in 2004, they asked the Presbyterian Church USA, the PCUSA, to send accompaniers to be alongside them, because that visible presence is itself a form of protection. So this isn't sort of, going down and standing in front of people. It's just being seen, being visible, and being a form of protection. And to cut a long story short, it was the Presbyterian Peace Fellowship that was the group to step up to the challenge on zero budget of preparing and sending short-term accompaniers to fill that role. And we've been doing it, whether regularly or sometimes intermittently, ever since, always in partnership with the PCUSA. And then COVID happened. And COVID interrupted the physical accompaniment, but we have been exploring ways to continue to work together, both in Colombia and now also in Agua Prieta on the border, the Mexican-US border, accompanying there as well, and finding that we have many things in common, not least police violence. That's actually playing out in similar ways in all of them. So that doesn't tell you about my experience in it, but it gives you kind of the background.
Well, we learned that you had to return to the US. Was that difficult for you? And what was that experience like?
Yeah, well, let me sort of first tell you about sort of my own experience in the program, and then I'll come back to the leaving. So I heard about the program right at its beginning in 2004, ironically at a meeting in Cuba with the Presbyterian Church there. And I trained as an accompanier in 2006, but my seminary studies and other commitments prevented me from serving till 2010, when I managed to wangle to spend my last seminary semester in Colombia, both as accompanier and researching the program. And then lo and behold, I was recruited to run the US end of the program. And I did so for over 3 years, actually starting as soon as I was graduated. And that's actually what I was ordained to. So I became a minister explicitly to work with the church in Colombia. And I've prepared and sent many accompaniers, and I've spent a lot of time in Colombia myself, as accompanier, as delegation leader, as seminary teacher. And I was there in March of this year, as you said, and it became increasingly apparent that I probably shouldn't be there anymore. So the return journey itself was not in any way difficult, although of course I quarantined when I returned. But the decision to leave was really pretty difficult. I had just spent an incredible few days alongside Bogota church leaders at a very rural FARC guerrilla reintegration camp, and also visiting the Truth Commission that was set up as part of the peace accords. And I was about to fly from Bogota to Urabá, which is a very rural area in northwest Colombia. And they had some awesome plans in place for me. But what really clinched the decision to leave was the thought that I might pick up COVID as I traveled there and bring it to an area where healthcare is, to put it mildly, not the best. And as it turned out, I left Colombia just before Colombia shut down, flights and all. And sadly, COVID has arrived. And in fact, I understand one of the pastors in Urabá has just died, Elkin Pereira, who was a long-term leader in the work for peace. So they are very definitely battling COVID in Colombia.
How does your background in science inform this call or work as a peacemaker?
Yeah, that's a funny one, really, because when I came to seminary, I kind of thought I was walking away from my science background and to focus on faith and social justice. But as it happened, two Colombia pastors, Milton Mejia and Adelaida Jimenez Cortes, who'd had to leave Colombia for a while for their safety, were fellow students of mine at McCormick. And when Adelaida heard about my background, she told me in no uncertain terms that I was coming to Colombia to teach religion and science. And that came to pass, and it strengthened my ties to Colombia, and it also led me to further studies at McCormick, THM in religion and science. And it led me to see that there are strong intersections between faith and science in issues such as racism for one, climate justice for another. And I'm a bit of a history buff, and I've really seen how faith and science have worked together for both good and ill in ways that affect justice and peace. And I'd rather they work together on the good side. So, so yes, I do bring my science into my theology and into my peacemaking work.
I know that you did travel. You do a lot of travel to Latin America. Can you share with us how this travel has influenced your faith, or has any experiences there really increased your faith with the work that you're doing?
Yeah, I have indeed traveled a lot to various parts of Central and South America and the Caribbean, with groups like the Cuba Church Partnership, the Presbyterian Peace Fellowship, CRLN, the Chicago Religious Leadership Network on Latin America. And right now I'm also part of a PCUSA study group on Central America. What that means is that when I've traveled in contexts that allow me to interact with some pretty awesome church leaders and community activists. And I'm reminded constantly of the strength and courage of those whose faith calls them even to put their lives on the line for work for justice and peace. So it kind of humbles me, because I visit and then leave. They stay. But they do also remind me and others of the work that we need to do in the United States, to bring back their stories, to build awareness, to advocate for more sort of just and peace-supporting US foreign policy. And I get involved in advocacy, and I also try and do teaching in churches on some of these issues to sort of spread the word. So it's certainly strengthened for me that link between faith and the work for justice.
Let's talk about your work as a professor at McCormick Theological Seminary. How does this work that you're doing and the program, the PFF program, how does that connect to your professorship and your teaching experience and your peacemaking experience with your students at McCormick?
Well, you as a fellow McCormick alum are pretty aware that McCormick and justice and peacemaking ideas go together fairly well, fairly easily. Perhaps the most obvious way in which the peacemaking work has intersected with my teaching was in a travel seminar that I led for McCormick students to Colombia back in 2016, when we actually worked alongside Colombian students to explore what it means to be church in contexts of violence, and realizing that yes, there's violence in Colombia, but there's also violence in Chicago and the United States. That was a powerful experience that we would have been repeating in January 2021, but for obvious reasons, that's off. But I would say that the whole peacemaking and justice sort of idea infuses my teaching more broadly, as I discuss with students and we share ideas about the implication of Christianity being not just God and me, however important that is, but also God and neighbor, and neighbor everywhere. So about building locally and globally the beloved community that Martin Luther King Jr. reminded us we are called to be.
I was thinking about that beloved community, and as it relates to the election cycle that we're in, as well as all of the things that's happening that deals with racism.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if you could share with us if there is an element of peacemaking that goes along with the thought of a beloved community. How do they, or do they, intersect and work together?
Enormously. No justice, no peace is one piece of it, and a clearly very important piece of it. But just the sort of whole idea that unless we can respect and see each other as fellow children of God, we are never going to make beloved community, and we are never going to make peace, and we are never going to treat each other with justice. The Presbyterian Peace Fellowship right now is having a 6-month sort of pause on many of its programs to really engage in issues of both race and police violence, because we just see it as so tied up with everything that we're doing. And as I say, it's not just in the US, it's global.
And that's a great work. I am thinking of if there were any experience with your PPF accompaniment program that has left you with a lasting impression. Is there someone you met? Was there a group of people that you work with that really left an indelible mark upon your heart? Would you share that with us?
There are so many. So anybody I'm leaving out, I have to apologize to. But one thing that this comes to mind right now, when I ran the US end of the accompaniment program, I was running the US end. Clearly there was a Colombian end, and they really ran the show and decided where we were needed and where we should go. And my counterpart was a delightful, lovable bear of a man called Herman Zarate, who ran the diaconia, which really just means the service arm of the Presbyterian denomination there. And I remember him sharing a story with me once that I use with students in churches. And he said when he was trying to get the churches that he worked with to really think about reaching out in service, he would ask them in that predominantly Catholic country how the local community would react if the local Catholic church closed. And people would go, there would be horror. Everybody would be upset. They wouldn't like it at all. And then he said, I would ask them, how would the community react if your church closed? And if the reaction wasn't as strong, what are you doing? Where is your engagement with your community? And that's clearly a message for folks in Colombia, and it's a message for folks here, that if we're not being seen to do God's work and building beloved community, we need to think again.
Thank you for joining us, Dr. Eastwood. I'm LaShondra Stevens for Different Drummers and the Greater Chicago Broadcast Ministries. Keep the faith.